The redaction had a shape to it, and after 4 years cataloging pre-fall records for the Meridian registry, Sena Okoye had learned to read the shape's redactions left the way a glazier reads the cracked lines in a pane before it lets go. This one was old, older than most of what crossed her desk, which was mostly petition logs and property transfers and the slow administrative sediment of 24 years of imperial tributary paperwork, dull enough that the registry trusted a 20-year-old junior archivist to handle the bulk of it unsupervised. The file had come up in a routine cross-index sweep, a legal appendix attached to a much larger document everyone in the registry simply called the compact, the armistice instrument that had ended the war on the 14th day after the World Assembly's last free session. And someone, a long time ago, with tools cruder than the ones the registry used now, had gone through this particular appendix with a black bar and cut 11 full clauses out of the readable record. 10 of the 11 were unrecoverable. Legal boilerplate, probably, procedural clauses nobody outside a treaty office would ever miss. The 11th had survived because whoever performed the redaction, working fast under whatever pressure a defeated planet's final government session had been operating under, had botched the edge of one scan pass by a margin of 6 pixels, and 6 pixels of unredacted text sat there in the corrupted original file like a hairline crack running clean through a locked door. Sena did not need 6 pixels to become fluent legal standard. She needed them to become curious, and curiosity was the one part of this job the registry had never quite managed to train out of her. However many times her supervisor reminded her that curiosity about pre-fall assembly business was, at best, a career-limiting habit, and at worst, the kind of habit that got people reassigned to postings nobody came back from. She ran the fragment through every restoration past the registry's systems allowed a junior clerk without a supervisor's authorization, which was 3, and on the third, past the shape of a sentence came back clean enough to read. The seat filled by legitimate speaker within 1 generation of standard reckoning from the date of signing, or the protections enumerated in Articles 4 through 11 shall lapse in full, and the world of Terra revert to unrestricted. The rest of the line was still black. She did not need the rest of the line. She had grown up 2 kilometers from the hall where that seat sat, had walked past it on school trips as a child, and stood in the roped-off gallery above it as an adult exactly twice. And she knew, the way every child raised in Meridian knew, that the seat had been empty since the day the war ended and was going to stay that way, because that was the oath. Because that was what the last free speaker of Earth had asked of the people she left behind before she went into the negotiation room that took her life and gave everyone else theirs. Sena had never once, in 20 years of hearing that story told to her as a bedtime prayer and a civic lesson and a vigil hymn, heard anyone mention a clause that made the seat's emptiness cost something with a date attached. Meridian had not been rebuilt so much as reoccupied. In the 24 years since the fall, its pre-war skyline of glass and stone left standing where the fighting had spared it and quietly repurposed everywhere it had not, so that the registry's own building, a squat, functional block of pre-fall civic architecture 2 streets from the hall, still bore, on its upper cornice, the eroded lettering of a name and purpose the current occupants had never bothered to remove, because removing it cost more than simply changing what the letters were used to mean. Ilthine administrators moved through the city's central district in small, unhurried groups, distinguishable at a glance by the rank cords on their formal robes, and by a bearing Sena had grown up thinking of as simply the way authority looked, the specific unhurried confidence of a species that had governed 40 other worlds long enough to stop finding the work remarkable. She had grown up believing that confidence was permanent, the way children believe most things about the world they are born into are simply how the world has always been and will always remain, and it was only in the last several years, cataloging the slow administrative erosion of rights the compact had once guaranteed in full, that she had begun to understand how much of that confidence rested on nothing sturdier than a population that had never once tested it. She checked the file's creation timestamp against the compact's signing date, cross-referenced it against the registry's own internal standard reckoning conversion tables. Because if there was one skill 4 years of this job had actually given her, it was an instinct for treaty dates that most people her age had never needed to develop. And the number the conversion gave her sat on her terminal screen with the flat, indifferent patience of every other administrative fact she processed in a working day. Except that this one made her hands go still on the desk. 24 years, 354 days since the compact was signed. One generation of standard reckoning was 25 years, exactly, defined in the compact's own preamble, a definition she had transcribed herself 18 months ago without once connecting it to anything. 11 days. She sat with that number for a long time after the registry's night shift had thinned out around her, the archive floor gone quiet except for the low hum of the climate systems, and the occasional footstep of a security drone on its rounds 2 levels up. And she did the thing every good archivist was trained never to do with an unverified fragment, which was believe it before she had a second source. She believed it anyway, because some things did not need a second source. They only needed you to finally notice the shape of the silence around them. The speaker's name had been Imelda Cho, and every child in Meridian learned the shape of her final week the way children on other conquered worlds learned different, harder shapes of the same kind of ending. A woman in her 60s, already ill in ways the histories glossed over politely, who had spent the 14 days of the war's final collapse doing the only thing left to her, which was buying time with words after every other currency the World Assembly possessed had already been spent. The recordings that survived from that negotiation, 3 hours of a 7-hour session, the rest lost when the relay station carrying the feed took a strike meant for a target 4 kilometers away, showed a woman who did not plead, did not perform the kind of desperate defiance later generations liked to imagine when they told the story to their children, but who instead argued clause by clause, hour by hour, against an ill-themed delegation that had arrived expecting an unconditional surrender and left, 7 hours later, having granted a defeated world tributary status instead of annexation, protected trade instead of open extraction, and 100 smaller mercies besides that the official compact text recorded in the flat. Bloodless language treaties, always used for the things that had cost the most to win. She had died 4 days after the signing, in a Meridian hospital 2 kilometers from the hall, of injuries the delegation's own medical staff had never fully explained, and no one afterward had the standing or the appetite to investigate. Her last recorded public words, delivered from a hospital bed to a vigil of exhausted aides and a handful of assembly members who had not yet been reassigned or arrested, were the ones every schoolchild in Meridian still recited on Remembrance Day, the ones carved into the stone lintel above the hall's main doors. Let the seat stand empty until earth is whole again, so that no one who comes after me mistakes what this cost for something given freely. Sena had recited those words herself, at 8 years old, standing in a line of other children on a school trip, without once understanding, until the night she found 6 pixels of buried legal text on a corrupted archive scan, that the sentence contained a hinge she had spent her entire life reciting past without hearing. Until, not forever, a condition offered by a negotiator who had spent 7 hours proving, clause by clause, that she understood exactly how conditions worked, and had chosen, in the last document she would ever help draft, to build one final condition into the grief she was leaving behind for people she would never meet. Elder Keeper Absalom Reyes had run the vigil of the seat for 19 years, since he was a much younger man with a much darker beard than the gray-white one he wore now, and in 19 years he had learned to recognize trouble on a person's face before they finished the walk from the hall's outer doors to the small vestry office where he took his morning tea and his complaints from the city's registry office, and on quiet evenings, the occasional visit from a young woman he had known, since she was small enough to be lost in the hall's public gallery, and had to be found by name over the intercom. He recognized it on Sena's face now, and set his tea down before she'd said a word. "You look like you found something you weren't looking for," he said. "I found something I was looking for and didn't know it," Sena said, and told him, in the low, careful voice of someone who had spent the walk over rehearsing exactly how much to say, about the redaction and the 6 pixels and the number that would not leave her alone. Absalom did not answer immediately. He was a patient man by training and by temperament both, the kind of patience the Vigil demanded of anyone who spent their working life maintaining a shrine to an oath most of the city treated as background scenery rather than a living obligation. And he let the silence sit long enough that Sena began to wonder if he'd heard her at all. "There were always rumors," he said finally, "among the older keepers. Something in the compact's fine print, something about the seat needing to be filled eventually, not just kept. Nobody ever found it. Nobody who looked ever came back to tell anybody what they'd found either, which the older keepers took as its own kind of answer." He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something between fear and a terrible, weary recognition. "Elder Vance went looking, 30 years ago, before your time and mine both. Filed 3 formal inquiries with the prefecture's archive office. Died in a transit accident 4 months after the 3rd one. Nobody who remembers him believes it was an accident, and nobody who remembers him has ever said so out loud, because saying it out loud is how you become the next transit accident. You think the Empire buried this?" "I think," Absalom said carefully, "that an oath which keeps an entire population quiet and grieving and staring at an empty chair for 25 years is a remarkably convenient oath for the people occupying that population to encourage, whether or not they wrote a word of it. I do not think the prefecture invented our grief, Sena. I think grief is real, and the speaker's sacrifice was real, and the oath we built around it was built by us, by people who loved her, in a week when loving her was the only thing anyone in this city had left to do. I think what happened after is that someone noticed how useful our grief was, and decided the kindest thing they could do for us was to never, ever remind us it had an expiration date." 11 days, Sena said. "That's not a rumor anymore, Absalom, that's a number." "Then you understand," he said, "why I am about to ask you to forget it." She did not forget it. She spent the next 2 days doing the one thing 4 years of training had prepared her to do better than almost anyone else in the registry, which was verify a document, and she verified this 3 separate ways. Against the compact's own internal cross-references, against a partial pre-redaction index, she found buried 9 folders deep in a storage tier nobody had queried in over a decade, and against the peculiar, telling fact that article structure in the readable compact skipped cleanly from Article 3 to Article 12, as though someone had simply lifted 8 numbered clauses whole out of a document and hoped nobody would ever count. On the 3rd day, she did the thing Absalom had specifically asked her not to do, and filed a formal inquiry with the prefecture's civil archive office, requesting an unredacted copy of Compact Appendix C for what she described, with the flattest bureaucratic language she could manage, as routine cataloging purposes. The response took 6 hours, which for the prefecture's civil archive office was fast enough to be its own kind of answer. Request denied. Appendix C is classified under Continuity Protocol 4, Prefecture Authority. Further inquiries regarding compact appendices require prefect-level authorization. This inquiry has been logged. This inquiry has been logged. She read that line 4 times, feeling something cold settle into her stomach that had nothing to do with fear of getting in trouble and everything to do with the sudden, complete certainty that Absalom had not been speculating. Someone, somewhere in the machinery of the prefecture, had built a system specifically designed to notice anyone who asked this exact question, and she had just told that system her name. 40 kilometers from the registry, in an administrative tower the Ilthene had built on the ruins of what had once been Meridian's central bank, and now called the prefecture seat. A name that had always struck Sena, on the rare occasions she'd had reason to think about it, as a small, deliberate cruelty, an empire that had taken the word seat and put it on its own building while leaving Earth's actual one empty. Prefect Calyx Dorn read the same automated flag Sena's inquiry had generated, on a screen that had been quietly logging every query touching Appendix C for 11 years, since the day Dorn had personally ordered the flag installed. Dorn was not, by the measures the prefecture used to sort its administrators, a cruel official. Cruelty was inefficient, and Dorn had built a 22-year career on efficiency, on running the Terra Prefecture with a lighter garrison and a smaller enforcement budget than almost any comparable tributary posting in the sector, on the theory, proven correct year after year, that a population left its own myths to manage itself required almost no active suppression at all. Dorn had not written the Vigil's oath. Dorn had not needed to. Dorn had only needed to notice, in the second year of the posting, that a grieving population which believed its own leader's death demanded permanent mourning was a population that policed its own compliance more thoroughly than any garrison could have managed, and had spent every year since quietly, patiently, making certain that nothing ever disturbed that belief. The continuance clause had never been Dorn's secret to keep, not originally. It had been the prefecture's standard boilerplate on every tributary compact the Ashgate concern's legal division drafted across 40 subject worlds. A clause meant, in the concern's own founding paperwork, to give conquered populations a plausible incentive towards stable self-governance. On most worlds it functioned exactly as designed. On Terra, it had become the single largest liability on Dorn's entire administrative ledger, because Terra's population had, without any prompting Dorn had ever authorized, built a religion around never using it, and the day someone finally did was the day Terra's protected tributary status. The trade restrictions, the terraforming bans, the labor conscription limits Dorn had spent 2 decades enforcing at genuine personal political cost against the Ashgate concern's repeated requests for exceptions, evaporated into an unrestricted resource designation that would make Dorn, upon its lapse, one of the most quietly celebrated administrators in the concern's entire sector portfolio. Dorn had 11 days left to make sure that happened, and had known the number for 11 years. The flag on the screen read, Okoye, Sena, Junior Registrar, Meridian Office. Third Verified cross-reference attempt, Appendix C flag threshold exceeded. Dorn read it twice, with the particular, unhurried attention of an administrator who had spent 11 years hoping this exact alert would never fire, and had nonetheless prepared, meticulously, for the day it did. Warden Marshal Karath, Dorn said, into a comm channel that connected directly to the prefecture's small garrison command, I need a name monitored quietly starting immediately. No detention. Not yet. I want to know everyone she talks to before we decide whether talking to her is still a mistake she gets to walk away from. The visitor arrived at Dorn's office 2 days later, unannounced in the way that only someone whose authority did not technically outrank a prefect's, but whose money quietly did, ever arrived. A compact, unhurried Ilthene in Ashgate concerned civilian dress rather than any imperial uniform, carrying the specific, cultivated calm of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted from a planetary administrator. Liaison Corvin, Dorn said without warmth. I was not informed of a scheduled visit. Scheduled visits generate records, Prefect, and the concern prefers this conversation stay off one. Corvin settled into the chair across from Dorn's desk without being offered it, and set a data slate down between them with the unhurried precision of a man laying out cards he already knew were winning ones. 11 years, Prefect. The Concerns Board has been extraordinarily patient with Terra's continued protected status, given the projected yield differential once those protections lapse. 11 years of patience is not the same thing as 11 years of forgetting there is a differential. The protections lapse on their own timeline, Dorn said. I have managed that timeline exactly as the concern required, quietly, without incident, without a single formal complaint from this population, in over 2 decades of administration. And now a junior archivist has filed a court inquiry that references the very clause your management depends on nobody ever reading, Corvin said. The board is aware, Prefect. The board would like reassurance that 11 years of quiet management has not become 11 years of quiet exposure. It has not, Dorn said, with more certainty in the words than currently sat anywhere in Dorn's own chest. The inquiry has been contained. It will remain contained. See that it does, Corvin said, rising, gathering the data slate with the same unhurried precision it had arrived with. The board is not in the habit of asking twice, Prefect, and I would remind you that an administrator's 22 years of quiet, successful management is precisely the kind of record that becomes very easy for a board to reconsider, once quiet stops being an accurate description of it. Dorn sat alone for a long time after Corvin's departure, looking at the closed door, and understood, with the specific clarity that came only from being reminded exactly whose interests a career had actually been serving all along, that there had never been a version of this posting where protecting Terra's population and protecting Dorn's own career pointed in the same direction for very much longer. Sena felt the watching before she understood what it was. A courier drone that idled a half-second too long outside the registry's front entrance on her walk home. A civil transit ticket that flagged for random inspection 2 days in a row on the same line she'd ridden without incident for 3 years. A neighbor 2 doors down who had never once said more than a passing hello and now lingered on the stairwell landing, whenever Sena's schedule put them there at the same time, asking after her day with a warmth that felt, for the first time in Sena's life, deliberately manufactured. She told Tomas Farrow about it on the 4th evening, mostly because Tomas was the only person she knew outside the registry, and the Vigil who had the specific, useful paranoia of someone who worked broadcast relay maintenance for the Meridian civil network, and had spent his whole career learning exactly how thoroughly that network could be used to watch people, rather than just inform them. You think they're running passive surveillance on you, Tomas said. Not a question, sitting on the low wall outside the maintenance depot where he worked, turning a signal calibration tool over in his hands out of the restless habit of someone who thought better with something to fidget with. I think I asked the wrong question in the wrong office, Sena said, and now there's a number attached to my name somewhere, and I don't know what the number means, but I know it's not good. What's the question? She told him. All of it, the redaction, the 6 pixels, the 11 days, Absalom's story about Elder Vance and the transit accident that everyone believed and nobody said out loud, and watched Tomas's face go through several stages of disbelief on the way to the specific, still expression of a man doing quiet arithmetic on his own. If that's real, he said slowly, if there's really a clause in the compact that says the protections lapse unless someone sits the seat, and the prefecture's known about it this whole time and buried it, then the Vigil's oath isn't protecting anyone, Sena said. It's protecting them. It's the most convenient piece of imperial policy this planet's ever produced, and we built it ourselves out of grief, and they never had to lift a finger. Tomas turned the calibration tool over twice more before he spoke again, the particular silence of a man who had already started solving a technical problem in his head before he'd finished deciding whether he believed the premise behind it. The civic relay grid runs through 6 junctions between here and the hall, he said slowly. 5 of them are locked down tight, prefecture monitored. The kind of access that gets you a Lieutenant Vern interview just for looking at the wrong panel too long. The sixth is the maintenance junction under the Hall Plaza itself. Original pre-fall infrastructure nobodies bothered fully modernizing because the prefecture never expected anyone with relay training to need access to it. I've been in there twice for routine cable work. I know the layout. If I could get a portable uplink rig built and staged there, timed right, I could push a feed straight onto the chorus civic band before anyone in a monitoring booth even registered the signal wasn't scheduled. You said if. I said if because building a rig that can hijack a prefecture-grade relay junction without tripping every alarm on the panel is not a weekend project, Sena. It's real work, days of it, and it has to survive being carried into a public plaza on the single most watched day of the year without anybody asking what's in the case. How many days do you need? All of them, Tomas said. Every one you've got left. So we'd better stop talking about whether I believe you and start talking about whether you're actually asking me to do this. Because once I start building, there's no version of the next 11 days where I'm not in this as deep as you are. Okay, Tomas said, standing up, tucking the calibration tool into his belt with the finality of a decision made. Okay, say I believe you, say it's real. What do you actually think you're going to do about it? You can't publish a legal appendix nobody's allowed to read. You can't file another inquiry. You already told me they logged the last one. You've got 11 days and a piece of information nobody with the authority to act on it is going to believe without proof they're not allowed to see. I'm not going to publish it, Sena said. I'm going to sit in it. Tomas stared at her for a long moment, the particular silence of a man recalculating everything he had just decided he understood about the conversation. You want to sit the seat, he said. The clause says a legitimate speaker has to fill it, not appointed, not elected. We don't have the machinery left to run an election in 11 days even if the prefecture allowed it, which it wouldn't. The compact's own definition, buried 3 clauses further down in the same appendix, says legitimate means recognized by the standing custom of the world in question. 24 years of Vigil custom recognizes exactly one thing about that seat, Tomas. That it's supposed to be filled by whoever the people of this city choose to trust with it, when the time comes. Nobody's ever had to define what that meant because nobody's ever tried it. I'm going to try it. You're a registry clerk, Tomas said, not unkindly, the way a friend points out a fact that needs pointing out. You're 20 years old. You catalog property transfers. I'm the only person on this planet who knows the date, Sena said. That has to count for something, or none of this counts for anything. They came for her 3 nights later. Not with the force Sena had half expected after Absalom's story about Elder Vance, but with the polite, procedural thoroughness of a civil compliance stop. 2 enforcement officers waiting outside the registry's staff exit when her shift ended, asking, with careful neutrality, whether she would accompany them to a prefecture substation for what they described only as a routine residency verification. The substation interview room was small, gray, and lit, with the flat, shadowless light Sena would later learn every prefecture facility on the planet seemed to share, and the officer conducting the interview, not Karath, but a mid-ranking enforcement lieutenant named Vern, who handled the questioning with the bored efficiency of someone who had done this exact procedure 1,000 times, and expected this instance to be no different from the rest, asked her, over the course of 40 careful minutes, about her work history, her travel patterns, her relationship to the Vigil of the seat, and twice, phrased 2 different ways, whether she had recently made any inquiries regarding classified compact documentation. I catalog pre-fall property records, Sena said, both times, in the flattest bureaucratic voice she could manage, the same voice she had spent 4 years using to describe her own job to people who found it as dull as she had once genuinely believed it to be. I wouldn't know a classified compact document if it crossed my desk. Most of what crosses my desk is boundary disputes and inheritance transfers. Vern watched her for a long moment with an expression that gave away nothing. And Sena understood, with a cold certainty that made the 40 minutes feel considerably longer than they were, that the lieutenant did not entirely believe her and had, nonetheless, nothing concrete enough to hold her on. A flagged inquiry on its own was not a crime. The prefecture's own automated systems generated thousands of them a week, most from nothing more sinister than curious clerks and confused petitioners. And detaining every one of them past a routine interview would have required exactly the kind of visible enforcement apparatus Dorn had spent 2 decades avoiding. "You're free to return home," Vern said finally, standing, gathering the interview slate with the same bored efficiency the whole session had carried. "Should any further inquiries of this nature come to the prefecture's attention, Registrar Okoye, I would strongly advise against pursuing them further. Some administrative curiosities are better left unsatisfied." She walked home through streets gone dark and quiet, her hands shaking in a way they had not shaken during the interview itself, and understood, standing finally in her own small apartment with the door locked behind her, that the warning had told her almost as much as the redaction had. Nobody built a routine compliance stop around a routine boundary dispute. They had let her go because they had nothing to hold her on, not because they had stopped watching, and the 11 days on her handheld's calendar had, in the space of one gray interview room, become considerably more real than they had been an hour before. The Vigil met her decision the way Sena had feared it would, which was with a wall of grief dressed up as principal, and the wall's youngest and most determined bricklayer turned out to be Petra Lynn, a keeper barely 2 years older than Sena herself, who had joined the order at 16 after losing both her grandparents in the same labor conscription sweep that the compact's protections had, in the years since, made rarer, and who met Sena in the hall's lower gallery 2 days before the deadline, with a look that had nothing soft left in it at all. "You're going to walk in there and sit in her chair," Petra said, not raising her voice, which somehow made it worse than shouting would have. "The chair we've kept empty for 24 years because a woman we never got to meet died so the rest of us could keep breathing. You're going to sit down in the middle of that, on Remembrance Day, in front of everyone who comes to mourn her, and you're going to call that an act of respect." "I'm going to call it survival," Sena said, "hers and ours both." She asked for the seat to stay empty. "She asked for the seat to stay empty until Earth was whole again," Sena said, and pulled up the translated fragment on her handheld, the one line of the compact's preamble she had read so many times in the last week that she could recite it without looking. "Not forever. Until." She put a condition on it, Petra, the same way she put a condition in that appendix, because she was a negotiator, not a martyr looking for a permanent monument. Somebody built a monument out of her condition and forgot to keep reading the sentence. "My grandparents used to tell me the compact was the only reason any of us were still breathing," Petra said, her voice tightening around something that had clearly been carried a long time before it was ever said aloud. "And then a labor sweep took them anyway, 6 years ago, on the grounds of some conscription exception. The prefecture's own paperwork claimed the compact permitted, and I spent a year afterward believing the protections were a lie the whole city told itself to make the empty chair feel like it meant something. The Vigil is the only thing that ever gave that grief a shape I could survive. You want me to believe the shape was wrong the whole time?" "I don't think the shape was wrong," Sena said. "I think the shape got used. There's a difference, Petra, even if it doesn't feel like one from inside the grief. You don't get to decide that. You're not Vigil. You're not even old enough to remember the fall." "Neither are you," Sena said, quiet, and watched something flicker across Petra's face that might have been the first honest doubt she'd shown since the conversation started. "We're the first generation that gets to decide anything about this, Petra. Everyone who actually remembers the fall is either gone or too frightened by what they remember to look past it. That's not a weakness. That's the only reason either of us is standing here free to argue about it, instead of digging in a labor camp on a resource world." Petra did not answer that. She turned instead and walked the length of the gallery to where Absalom stood near the vestry door, close enough that Sena could hear the low, urgent shape of their conversation without catching the words. And when the elder keeper finally crossed the gallery floor to where Sena waited, his face carried an expression she had not seen on it since the night she'd first told him about the redaction. "I spent 19 years telling myself the oath was the point," Absalom said. "That keeping the seat empty was the whole of what we owed her. I think I was afraid to ask what filling it might cost, because I already suspected, somewhere I never let myself look directly, that someone benefited from my never asking. You've made me look directly at it, Sena, and I find I do not thank you for that, and I intend to help you anyway, because 19 years of grief without an ending is not devotion. It is only a very long, very well-dressed kind of surrender." And Petra buried 2 grandparents to a labor sweep. The compact's protections were supposed to prevent from ever happening to anyone else, Absalom said. "Give her time. She is not your enemy, Sena. She is only more afraid than you are, and fear that old does not turn on a single conversation." Getting a clean, unredacted copy of Appendix C proved to be, in the end, less a matter of stealth than of finding exactly one person inside the prefecture, whose job depended on the document existing intact somewhere. And Tomas found that person's name 3 nights later buried in a civil relay routing log that had nothing to do with archives at all. Adjutant Vashtel, Imperial Court of Record, Terra Prefecture, whose office maintained the only complete, unredacted copy of every compact ever signed on any Ilthine tributary world, because imperial law required a court of record to preserve original instruments in full regardless of any administrative redaction applied to public copies, and had required it for longer than the Terra Prefecture itself had existed. Getting into that office was the easy part, in the end, because the Court of Records archive wing sat inside the prefecture seat's public administrative floor, open during standing hours to any registered petitioner with a filed grievance. And Sena filed one, a genuine dispute over a property boundary 2 streets from her own apartment, real enough to survive scrutiny, mundane enough that nobody flagged it against the alert sitting on her name from 6 days earlier. Because the system built to catch her had been built to watch for another inquiry about Appendix C, not a bored-looking petitioner waiting her turn in a public queue. Vashtel turned out to be younger than Sena had pictured, an Ilthine jurist with the pale gray-violet skin and long, deliberate hands of their species, wearing the plain gray robes of a court clerk rather than the rank cords of an administrator, and listening to Sena's manufactured property dispute with the flat, professional patience of someone who had heard several thousand disputes exactly like it, and expected several thousand more. "Your case is straightforward," Vash said when the recitation was done, marking the file for standard review. "You'll have a ruling within the week." "Before I go," Sena said, and felt her pulse climb in a way 4 years of registry training had never once prepared her for, "I have a research question, unrelated to the case. Professional curiosity, I work in civil archives myself." "Ask," Vash said, without particular interest. "Does the Court of Record maintain complete instruments of every tributary compact, including redacted appendices?" Something in Vash's posture changed, subtle enough that Sena might have missed it if she had not spent 4 years learning to read exactly this kind of small, professional stillness in people, who suddenly did not want to answer a question honestly. "That is not a research question," Vash said. "That is Appendix C." "Yes," Sena said, and did not look away. Vash was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Sena understood, with a lurch of fear that nearly undid 4 years of composure, that this was the moment the entire plan either survived or ended, in a small public office, in front of a jurist who could end it with a single word into a calm channel. "I have held that instrument's complete text in this office for 11 years, Vash said finally, low enough that no one 3 desks away could hear it. I have watched a prefect I respect professionally spend 11 years making certain no one on this world ever reads it. I have told myself, every one of those 11 years, that my oath is to the record's integrity, not its use, and that what the prefecture does with a document I merely preserve is not my concern. Vash's long fingers went still on the desk. I do not believe that anymore. I believe I have been telling myself a very comfortable lie for 11 years because the alternative required me to notice that preserving a truth nobody is permitted to see is not neutrality. It is complicity with a very long silence. Will you help me? I will not smuggle you a document, Vash said. That would be theft of a court instrument, and it would be inadmissible the moment anyone challenged its provenance, which the prefecture will certainly do. But if a legitimate petitioner formally requests, through proper court channel, a certified true reading of a specific instrument's specific clause, in open session, on a date of the petitioner's choosing, that is not theft. That is the single oldest right the imperial court of record has ever guaranteed any tributary population, on every world this empire has ever conquered, because the empire has always needed its subjects to believe its law meant something. I can accept that filing. I cannot promise you the prefecture will allow the session to occur. But I can promise you that once I accept the filing, it exists in this court's own record, and this court's own record cannot simply be made to disappear, not even by a prefect. There is a procedural cost to what you're describing, Vash said, setting down the data slate, folding both long-fingered hands together with the deliberate care of someone thinking through several moves at once. An open session reading filed on a date of the petitioner's choosing requires 72 hours public notice on the court's own registry, which cannot be quietly withdrawn once posted without generating its own separate record of the withdrawal. If the prefecture wishes to prevent the reading from occurring, it will have exactly 72 hours warning in which to try, and every hour of that warning will be visible to anyone who knows to look at the court's public docket. I am telling you this because I want you to understand precisely what you are choosing, Registrar Okoye. You are not asking me to hide this. You are asking me to make it as difficult to hide as any filing in this court's history. That's exactly what I'm asking, Sena said. Then I will need the date, Vash said, and I will need it today because the 72-hour clock does not wait for either of us to feel ready. File it for Remembrance Day, Sena said. 11 days from now becomes 4 by then. File it for the one day this whole city already gathers at the hall. Vash's expression, for the first time in the conversation, carried something that was not professional caution. You intend to force the reading to happen in front of the one crowd the prefecture cannot quietly disperse without becoming its own headline, Vash said. That is either extremely clever or extremely foolish, Registrar Okoye. It's both, Sena said. It's always going to be both. I'd rather it be both in front of witnesses than neither, alone, in a prefecture holding cell. She left the Court of Record's public floor the way she had entered it, unhurried, folder of manufactured property paperwork tucked under one arm, and made it exactly as far as the administrative tower's ground-level checkpoint before a security sweep. Routine, she told herself, the kind that ran every hour on a rotating schedule the prefecture's own public notices bragged about as a transparency measure. Pulled her aside for a bag inspection that lasted 4 full minutes, while a young enforcement technician ran a scanner slowly over the folder's contents, over her handheld, over the small data chip Vash had at the last possible second. Pressed into her palm, with instructions murmured too low for anyone 3 meters away to catch. The chip held nothing incriminating on its own, only a copy of the property dispute filing, and a formal receipt confirming Vash's acceptance of Sena's second, real filing, the one that would not read as anything but routine legal correspondence to a scanner built to flag classified document transfers rather than properly filed court receipts. And Sena stood very still, breathing carefully, while the technician's scanner passed over it twice without triggering. Clear, the technician said, handing the folder back with the same bored efficiency Lieutenant Verne had shown 3 nights earlier, and Sena walked the rest of the way out of the tower with her pulse hammering hard enough that she was certain, for several minutes, that everyone on the street could hear it. Prefect Dorn learned of the filing 4 hours after Vashtel logged it, because every court of record filing that referenced Appendix C by name generated the same automated flag Sena's original inquiry had, and Dorn read it standing at the tall window of the prefecture seat's upper office, looking down at the city of Meridian spread out gray and orderly under an overcast sky, at the small dark shape of the assembly hall 4 kilometers distant, its dome just visible above the surrounding rooftops. 22 years of careful, patient, minimally intrusive administration, and it had come down to a junior civil archivist and a jurist who had apparently decided, after 11 years of loyal silence, to develop a conscience at the single worst possible moment for Dorn's entire career. "Warden Marshal Carath," Dorn said, and this time there was nothing measured left in the voice at all. "I need the hall's public access suspended for Remembrance Day. Site security concerns. Renovation. I do not care what the official reason is. I care that the crowd that normally fills that gallery on that specific day does not fill it this year." "Prefect," Carath said, "the Remembrance Day gathering is the single largest sanctioned public assembly on this entire world. Canceling it with 4 days' notice will draw more attention than allowing it to proceed." "Then detain the archivist," Dorn said, quietly, before the filing date. "A civil infraction, a transit violation, anything that gets her off the street for a week without generating a formal charge that requires a public hearing." "The jurist has already logged the filing in open court record," Carath said. "Detaining the petitioner after the filing exists does not make the filing disappear, Prefect. It only makes it look like the prefecture is afraid of what the filing contains." Dorn turned from the window, and for the first time in the entire 11-year history of the file, allowed something that was not quite panic and not quite fury to surface, fully, in front of a subordinate. "I'm afraid of what the filing contains, Warden Marshal," Dorn said. "I have spent 22 years keeping this world's protections intact against every pressure the Ashgate concern could apply, and I have done it by making certain this population never once tested the one clause that would end it all in a single afternoon. I am not afraid of a girl. I am afraid of a document I have spent 11 years hiding finally being read aloud, in a room full of witnesses, by an officer of a court I cannot legally silence without destroying the very legitimacy this empire's law depends on to keep 40 subject worlds compliant without a garrison on every corner." Dorn exhaled, slow, and the measured administrator's voice came back, colder now, more final. "Move every enforcement unit under your command to the hall on Remembrance Day. If the girl attempts to reach the seat before the reading is formally opened, you will prevent it. Quietly, if quietly is still available to us. Otherwise, however the situation requires." Dorn spent the 72 hours between the filing's public posting and Remembrance Day itself, doing the only thing an administrator with no remaining legal lever left could do, which was watch the court's public docket refresh, hour after hour, for any sign that Vashtel's filing had been quietly amended or withdrawn, and finding, every time, that it had not. A formal request to the Court of Record for an emergency stay, filed on Dorn's personal authority the second morning, was returned within 6 hours with a curt procedural denial, citing the exact statute Dorn had spent 2 decades relying on other people never reading closely enough to invoke. A sitting prefect held no standing to suspend an open petitioner filing absent a documented security threat verified by an independent tribunal, and no independent tribunal existed anywhere in the Terra Prefecture's chain of command that Dorn could convene inside 72 hours without the request itself becoming a matter of permanent record. By the morning of Remembrance Day, standing again at the tall window of the prefecture seat's upper office, watching the plaza below fill slowly with the first dark-clothed families of the day. Dorn understood, with the specific, hollow clarity that came only at the end of a long losing effort, that every tool built over 22 years to manage this population quietly had been built for a population that never tested the tools, and none of them, not one, had ever been designed for a morning like this one. The night before Remembrance Day, Sena sat alone in her small apartment for a long time without turning on the lights, the way she sometimes did when a decision had already been made, and there was nothing left to do but wait for morning to arrive and make it real. She had packed nothing, because there was nothing to pack. No plan that survived past noon the next day involved a version of her life that needed luggage, only a version that either continued in a shape she could not yet picture, or stopped entirely, in a prefecture-holding cell or somewhere considerably more final. And she had spent the last several nights refusing to let herself finish that second thought all the way to its end. She thought instead of her mother, 4 years gone now to a labor accident. The compact's own protections were supposed to have prevented and had, in the specific, grinding way protections written by exhausted negotiators, sometimes failed to anticipate every gap, not quite managed to prevent after all. She thought of the registry desk she had sat at for 4 years, cataloging the small, dry, administrative bones of a world that had learned, generation by generation, to mistake careful silence for survival. She thought mostly of the 6 pixels, and of how strange it was that the entire shape of her life had turned on something so small, so nearly invisible, that any archivist with slightly less stubborn curiosity would have logged the file as unrecoverable and moved on to the next item in the queue without a second thought. Petra found her there an hour before dawn, letting herself in with the spare key Absalom had given her weeks earlier for exactly this kind of watch, and said nothing for a long while, only sat beside her on the narrow apartment steps in the dark, until the silence itself became its own kind of company. "I still don't know if I believe this is the right way to honor her," Petra said eventually, quiet, no longer carrying the sharp edge she'd worn in the hall's lower gallery weeks earlier. "I don't think I'll know until it's over, one way or the other. But I know Absalom believes it, and I have spent 6 years trusting his judgment over my own fear, and I am not going to stop now, on the one day it might actually matter." "Thank you," Sena said, and meant it more completely than she had meant almost anything else she'd said in the last 11 days. "Don't thank me yet," Petra said, standing, offering a hand down to pull Sena up off the cold steps. "Thank me tomorrow night, if there is one, and we'll see how either of us feels about it then." Remembrance Day dawned gray over Meridian, the particular flat, colorless light the city always seemed to produce on the anniversary, whether or not the actual weather cooperated, and by mid-morning the plaza outside the assembly hall had filled with more people than Sena had ever seen gathered in one place in her life. Families in the plain dark clothes the day traditionally called for, old veterans of the fall standing in small silent clusters. Children too, young to understand the occasion, carried on shoulders, so they could see the hall's dome above the crowd. Vendors who on any other day would have filled the plaza's edges with the ordinary noise of a city going about its business had, by long custom, nobody had ever needed to legislate, stayed home, so that the only sounds moving through the gathered thousands were footsteps and low voices, and somewhere near the plaza's edge, a lone brass instrument playing the slow, wordless tune the Vigil had used to open every remembrance ceremony for 24 years. Sena had attended this gathering every year of her life she could remember, first as a child on her mother's shoulders and later on her own 2 feet, and had never once, in all those years, looked at the crowd and thought of it as anything other than a shared, private grief the whole city carried together. She looked at it now and saw, for the first time, exactly what Absalom had tried to tell her weeks earlier. An entire population, gathered once a year to stare at an empty chair, trained by 24 years of unbroken custom into believing that staring was the whole of what loyalty required. Sena moved through the gathering crowd in the same plain dark clothes as everyone else, unremarkable, invisible in the way she needed to be, with Tomas 20 meters behind her carrying a maintenance case that held, instead of the calibration tools the case was designed for, a relay uplink rig he had spent 3 sleepless nights building from parts he was technically not supposed to have access to. And with Petra Lynn, who had come in the end, without ever quite saying she believed in what Sena was doing. Only that she would not let her walk into the hall without at least one keeper at her side, moving through the crowd on Sena's other flank, watching the hall's entrance with the trained, wary attention of someone who had spent 6 years learning to read a crowd for trouble. Absalom was already inside, where his office required him to be on this day above all others, standing at the vestry door in his ceremonial robes, and it was Absalom who saw the enforcement units first, filing in through the hall's side entrances in loose, deliberately unhurried pairs that anyone not specifically watching for them would have mistaken for ordinary security presence. And it was Absalom who understood. With the specific dread of a man who had spent 19 years learning to read the prefecture's moods, that Dorn had chosen the second option Karath had offered. Sena felt the crowd's texture change before she understood why. A subtle stiffening of posture rippling backward from the hall's main doors, and Petra's hand closed on her arm. "They're not letting people through the main gallery," Petra said low. "They're funneling everyone into the outer plaza and holding the doors." "Vash filed the reading for noon," Sena said. "Open session, public record. They can slow the crowd down. They can't cancel a filed court proceeding without making it front-page news across every relay in the sector." "They don't need to cancel it," Petra said. "They just need to make sure you're not in the room when it happens." Tomas's voice came low through the small calm bead in Sena's ear, carrying the tight, focused calm of a man doing 3 things at once. "I've got a line into the relay junction under the plaza. I can push a feed onto the chorus network the second something worth broadcasting happens, but I need line of sight to the hall's internal transmitter to do it, which means I need to be inside, which means I need a door that isn't currently full of Warden Marshal Karath's people." "There's a service entrance." Absalom's voice came in over the same channel, quieter, steadier than Sena had expected, "behind the vestry that the Vigil has used for deliveries since before I took this post. It is not guarded, because as far as the prefecture's own security schematics are concerned, it does not officially exist." The service corridor ran narrow and dim behind the hall's public spaces, smelling of old stone and candle wax, and the particular dry mustiness of a building that had stood mostly closed to daily use for 24 years. And Sena moved through it with Petra close behind, Tomas peeling off at a side junction toward the transmitter access Absalom had described, the 3 of them synchronized by nothing more than a shared, unspoken understanding that they had exactly one attempt at this, and no version of the plan that survived a second try. They came up through the vestry, into the gallery's lower level, and found Absalom waiting exactly where he'd said he would be, standing between them and the short flight of steps that led up onto the hall's central floor, where the seat sat exactly as it always had, a plain, dark, unadorned chair on a low dais beneath the dome's gray overhead light, ringed by an empty velvet cord that had not been crossed by a living person in 24 years. Vashtel stood a short distance from the seat, in formal court robes rather than the plain gray clerk's dress from their first meeting, a data slate held in both hands, waiting with the flat patience of a jurist for the proceeding's official start time, and it was the sight of Vash standing there, alone, resolute, in a hall the prefecture had tried to empty of everyone but its own enforcement units, that told Sena the filing had survived every attempt to bury it. "Noon," Vash said quietly, as Sena came up the last step in 4 minutes. Warden Marshal Karath's voice reached them from the far side of the hall floor before Sena had crossed halfway to the seat, amplified through a hall-wide address channel that had clearly never been designed for this use, cold and formal and carrying easily across the dome's acoustics. Registrar Okoye, you are ordered to withdraw from the hall floor. This gathering has been reclassified as a security incident under prefecture authority. Adjutant Tell has an open court filing on this floor, Sena called back, her own voice shaking slightly despite every effort to keep it steady, for a certified reading of Compact Appendix C at noon in public session. I am a registered witness to that filing. I have every right to be here. The filing is suspended pending security review, Karath said, and began moving across the hall floor with a dozen enforcement personnel fanning out behind, unhurried, methodical, the exact controlled advance of someone who had done this before and expected no meaningful resistance. Court filings cannot be suspended by prefecture security order, Vash said, loud enough to carry, stepping forward to put themselves between the advancing line and the dais. Only by a ruling court authority, Warden Marshal, and I am the ruling court authority present on this floor. You have no jurisdiction to suspend my own proceeding. Karath did not slow. Adjutant, step aside. I will not, Vash said, and Sena, moving past the jurist toward the seat with her heart hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, understood in that moment that Vash Tell, who had spent 11 years telling themselves their oath was to the record and not its use, had just chosen, in front of an armed warden marshal, exactly which oath they actually believed in. It was Absalom who reached the enforcement line first, not Karath's own people crossing into it, stepping directly into their path with his arms spread and his ceremonial robes catching the gray overhead light, an old man in the wrong place, at exactly the moment courage required someone to occupy it. You will not cross this floor, Absalom said, on this day in this hall without going through every keeper who has kept faith with this seat for a generation. Elder Rays, Karath said, something almost like reluctance crossing the officer's face, stand aside. This does not need to become. Petra Lynn was already moving, not toward the seat but toward Absalom's side, planting herself beside him with the same wary readiness she had carried through the crowd outside, and behind her, drawn by some current none of them had planned, 3 more vigil keepers came up from the lower gallery to stand with their elder, an unarmed line of grief and stubbornness holding a floor against Karath's dozen. Karath hesitated for just a moment, in a way none of the officer's earlier orders had shown, a flicker of something that might, in a different career, in a different posting, have become genuine reluctance, the specific stillness of a professional soldier looking at an old man spread arms and a line of unarmed keepers and finding, for one full second, that the order in front of them did not feel like the kind of order a career was supposed to survive giving. It was not enough. Karath had been given no authorization to stand down, and a warden marshal who hesitated too visibly in front of a dozen subordinates lost more than a single confrontation, and the moment passed, and the forward line moved again. Karath's forward line reached them anyway, because orders were orders and the warden marshal had been given none permitting hesitation, and in the scramble that followed, hands on robes, a shove that put one young keeper on the stone floor, Petra's voice raised in a furious shout that cut through the hall's acoustics. It was Absalom who took the fall meant to clear a path through the line, an enforcement officer's shoulder catching the old man square in the chest hard enough to put him down. His head striking the dais steps with a sound Sena heard even over the chaos and would hear again. She knew immediately, for the rest of her life. The hall went for one terrible second, entirely silent. Sena did not stop moving. She understood, with a clarity that felt almost separate from the grief already tearing through her chest, that stopping now made whatever had just happened to Absalom mean nothing at all, and she crossed the last few meters of open floor and put her hand on the seat's plain, worn wooden arm, and sat down, in front of Karath's frozen enforcement line, in front of Vash Tell's raised data slate, in front of the hall's dome and the gray overhead light, and 24 years of an empty chair. Exactly as noon struck across every clock in the building. Tomas's voice cracked through the calm beat a half-second later, breathless, triumphant, terrified all at once. Feeds live. Chorus relay, full hall channel. I've got it pushed to every terminal in the sector that's tuned to the standard civic band. I don't know how long before someone cuts it, but it's live right now. Then read it, Sena said to Vash, her voice raw, her hand still gripping the seat's arm hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Absalom's stillness at the base of the dais, a weight she could feel in every part of her body and could not yet, let herself turn toward. Read the clause. Now before they cut the feed, before anything else happens. Read it. Petra had dropped to Absalom's side the instant he fell, her fury at Karath's line forgotten in the sudden, terrible focus of someone checking for a pulse she was afraid not to find, and the sound she made when she found one, ragged, thin, alive, but only barely, cut across the frozen hall louder than anything Karath's advancing officers had said all afternoon. "He's breathing," she called, not looking up, her hands pressed hard against the old man's chest. "He's breathing. Someone get a medical unit now." The enforcement line had stopped moving entirely. Karath's own officers frozen in the specific, uncertain way soldiers froze when an order's consequence became suddenly, physically undeniable in front of them. And in that frozen half-second, with grief and fear and a terror that had nothing to do with her own safety anymore tearing through her chest all at once, Sena understood that this was the only window she was ever going to get. Vashtel raised the data slate, and in a voice that carried across the hall's dome and out through Tomas's live relay, feed to every screen in the sector tuned to the civic band, began to read the words that had sat black and buried for 24 years. By authority of the Imperial Court of Record, Terra Prefecture, this is a certified true reading of Compact Appendix C, Article 7, as preserved in the court's original unredacted instrument. A breath, and then the words themselves, the one Sena had first glimpsed in 6 broken pixels on a corrupted archive scan, now spoken whole, unbroken, into a hall gone utterly silent except for the sound of Vash's steady voice. The seat filled by legitimate speaker within 1 generation of standard reckoning from the date of signing, or the protections enumerated in Articles 4 through 11 shall lapse in full, and the world of Terra revert to unrestricted resource designation under standard tributary law. Legitimate speaker is defined, for the purposes of this article, as any person recognized by the standing custom of the world in question as fit to hold that world's trust. Vash lowered the slate and turned, deliberately, to face the crowd now pressing against every doorway the enforcement line had failed to hold. Thousands of faces visible through the hall's open entrances and thousands more. Sena understood with a lurch, watching on whatever screen the chorus feed had reached across the sector. "Registrar Sena Okoye sits the seat of Terra at this hour," Vash said, "before this court, before this city, and before this empire's own broadcast network. I certify, as an officer of the Imperial Court of Record, that this act satisfies Article 7's requirement in full, and that the protections of Articles 4 through 11 are, as of this reading, preserved." "This certification is void," Karath said, but the words came out without the weight the Warden Marshal's earlier orders had carried, and Sena, still gripping the seat's arm, still refusing to look away from the enforcement line even as grief for Absalom threatened to close her throat entirely, understood why. The feed was live. Thousands of people had just watched an officer of the Imperial Court of Record certify, in a formal proceeding, on an open channel, exactly the kind of legal act the Empire's entire system of tributary law depended on subject worlds believing was real and unbreakable. Undoing it now, in front of this many witnesses, would not just cost Dorn a career. It would cost the Empire something it could not easily buy back on 39 other worlds watching how Terra's certification was handled. 41 light-years away, on a tribute world called Kessen's Reach that Sena Okoye had never heard of and would likely never visit. An Ashvin det crew foreman named Avron Tail sat in a barracks common room at the end of a 14-hour shift and watched, on a public terminal tuned to the standard civic band, because the private channels cost coin none of the crew possessed, a grainy relay feed of an old man falling on a stone floor on a planet called Terra, and a young jurist reading a legal clause into a silent hall, and a young human woman sitting, hands white-knuckled, in a chair that had apparently sat empty for 24 years. Avron did not know the Compact's Article 7, did not know the name Continuance Clause, and would not have recognized the word Terra as anything other than one more distant tributary world among the 40 the Empire held. What Avron understood, watching the feed with the rest of the barracks crowding in around the terminal in a silence that had nothing to do with the broadcast's audio quality, was simpler than any of that. That somewhere in this empire, a population the size of a whole world had found a clause in its own surrender terms that the people holding the surrender had spent a generation hoping nobody would ever read, and had read it anyway, out loud, in front of everyone. It was not the kind of thing det crew foremen on distant tribute worlds were supposed to find hope in. Avron found it anyway, and said nothing about it to anyone for 3 days, and then began, quietly, asking questions about his own world's compact that nobody in his barracks had ever thought to ask before. Prefect Dorn watched the feed from the prefecture seat's upper office with the specific, cold understanding of a career administrator watching 22 years of careful work collapse in real time, and reached, in the end, for the one tool that remained, which was not force, because force applied now would only confirm on an open channel exactly what Dorn had spent a career making certain no one ever had cause to say aloud about imperial rule. "Get me Grand Marshal Vessen's office," Dorn said, into a channel that had not been used in 4 years, "and tell them the Terra Prefecture requires immediate relief." The relief came within the hour, not because Dorn's request carried any particular urgency in the Grand Marshal's queue, but because a court of record certification broadcast live across a full sector's civic relay network was precisely the kind of unmanaged incident that triggered automatic sector command review. And the review that followed, conducted over the following 3 days by officers who owed Dorn nothing, and the Ashgate concerns political favors even less, found exactly what the record itself had already made undeniable: that a prefect had spent 11 years suppressing a legal instrument specifically to prevent a subject population from exercising a right the compact itself guaranteed them, and had, in the final hours of that suppression, ordered enforcement action against an open court proceeding that resulted in the death of an unarmed civilian. Dorn was recalled to the core worlds within the week, the specific bureaucratic language of the recall order careful, as such language always was, to avoid the word disgrace while making its meaning unmistakable to every administrator who read it. Liaison Corvin's name appeared nowhere in the review board's published findings, which surprised no one who understood how the Ashgate concern's political weight actually moved through Imperial Sector Command, and Dorn's final act as Prefect of Terra, 3 hours before the transfer shuttle departed, was a short, formal message to the review board requesting that the record reflect 22 years of otherwise unblemished administration. A request the board granted in the end, because bureaucracies, Ilthine or human, rarely saw much profit in making an example of a competent administrator's single catastrophic year, when a quiet transfer accomplished the same practical result, with considerably less institutional embarrassment. Warden Marshal Karath, who had given the order that put Absalom Reyes on the ground but had not, in the review's careful accounting, ordered the specific action that killed him, was reassigned to a garrison posting 11 systems away, in what the review board's own internal notes described, with a bluntness rare in imperial administrative language, as a demotion in every practical sense that mattered. Karath requested, and was granted, A single meeting with Sena before the transfer, conducted in the same small vestry office where Absalom had once taken his morning tea, and said little beyond a formal acknowledgment of the order's consequences and a request, made without any apparent expectation it would be granted, that the record of Absalom Reyes' death not be used as a symbol beyond what the facts themselves warranted. I gave an order I believed was lawful, Karath said, standing stiffly in a doorway that had seen 19 years of gentler visitors. I did not give an order to kill an old man on a stone floor. I understand that distinction will mean very little to the people mourning him. It means a great deal to me, and I did not expect that to matter to anyone but myself, so I will simply say it once and let it stand for whatever it is worth. It's worth something, Sena said, after a long moment, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Not enough to change what happened, but something. Adjutant Vashtel remained at the Court of Records Meridian office through the transition, one of a small handful of prefecture staff the caretaker administration chose to retain rather than replace, and Sena found, in the weeks that followed, that she trusted no one else in the new administration's ranks nearly so completely. Not because Vash had become an ally in any sentimental sense, but because Vash's 11 years of careful, professional silence had broken in the end. For reasons that had nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with an oath, the jurist had finally decided to take seriously in full, and Sena had learned, over the course of one very long day in the hall, that an ally who acted from principle rather than affection was very often the more reliable kind. Absalom Reyes was buried 6 days later, in the small Vigil cemetery behind the hall he had served for 19 years, in a ceremony attended by more people than the cemetery's grounds had ever held at once, and Sena stood at the graveside in the same plain dark clothes she had worn on Remembrance Day, with Petra Lynn beside her, no longer wary, no longer holding herself at the careful distance she had kept through every conversation before the hall floor. And with Tomas a step behind them both, his relay case finally empty of anything more urgent than the small honor of carrying flowers. "He asked me once," Sena said when it came her turn to speak, her voice steadier than she'd expected it to be, "what filling the seat might cost. I don't think either of us understood when he said it that the answer would be him." She looked out at the gathered crowd, at faces she recognized from the registry, and the vigil and the crowd outside the hall, at Vashtel standing near the back in plain civilian dress rather than court robes, present as a mourner rather than an officer of record. He spent 19 years keeping an oath he came to believe had been turned into a cage by people who benefited from our never testing it. He helped me break it anyway, knowing what it might cost him, because he decided in the end that grief without an ending is not devotion. It's surrender in very well-dressed clothes. She paused and let herself look, finally, directly at the small stone marker that had not yet had time to weather. "I intend to spend whatever time I hold this seat making sure his ending mattered." The caretaker prefect, a career administrator named Havern Ost with none of Dorn's 22 years of accumulated local judgment, and considerably more visible anxiety about the posting than any predecessor Sena had heard described, requested a formal meeting in her first week. Conducted with a stiffness that betrayed exactly how unfamiliar the entire situation was to an administrator trained on postings, where the local population had never once produced anything resembling a speaker. "I want to be direct with you, Registrar Speaker Okoye," Ost said, correcting the title with visible effort, seated across a table in the hall's small administrative annex that had not hosted a formal negotiation in 24 years. "Sector Command has made it clear that this posting is to avoid, at every possible turn, repeating the circumstances that led to my predecessor's recall. I do not know what that means practically for how you and I are meant to work together. I have never administered a world with an active speaker's office in it. Most of my colleagues consider the very concept an administrative curiosity from 3 centuries of imperial expansion ago." "It means," Sena said, That when I bring you a violation of Article 4's labor protections, you correct it, instead of burying it for 11 years and hoping I never read the fine print." Ost was quiet for a moment, and Sena watched something shift behind the administrator's carefully neutral expression. The specific, uncomfortable recalibration of someone realizing that an entire career's assumptions about how tributary administration was supposed to function had just been handed a counterexample. It had no established procedure for managing. "Yes," Ost said finally. "I believe that is exactly what it means." 6 weeks into what the prefecture's replacement administration had begun calling, with visible discomfort, the Terra speakership, Sena sat in the small vestry office that had once been Absalom's, going through the same kind of administrative correspondence she had once processed as routine registry work, except that now the letters arrived addressed to her directly, from Vigil chapters in cities she had never visited. From families petitioning for the restoration of labor protections, the old continuance clause had guaranteed, and Dorn's 11 years of quiet suppression had allowed to erode at the margins. From a caretaker prefecture office that had, for the first time in 24 years, begun scheduling regular formal meetings with an actual human counterpart, instead of simply issuing directives, into an administrative vacuum. The seat itself sat empty most days, because Sena had learned quickly that a speaker who spent every hour perched on a ceremonial chair accomplished considerably less than one who used the office's actual authority to sit across a table from prefecture administrators and hold them to a compact they had spent decades hoping no one would read closely enough to enforce. But the Vigil had not disbanded, and would not, because Petra Lynn had taken up Absalom's old post with a fierceness that made clear she intended to spend the rest of her life making certain no future prefect ever again found it convenient to mistake this city's grief for permanent silence. And once a year, on Remembrance Day, the seat still stood empty for exactly 1 hour at noon, not out of an oath that had outlived its purpose, but because Sena had decided. In the first week of holding an office nobody currently alive had held before her, that some traditions deserved to survive the reason they were originally invented, reshaped instead of abandoned, an hour of stillness inside a year of work. One of the first formal petitions to reach her desk under the restored Article 4 labor protections came from a mining district 300 kilometers south of Meridian, from a foreman named Defied, whose entire shift had spent 11 years working conscription hours the old continuance clause was supposed to have made illegal the moment the compact lapsed into full effect. Hours the district's own prefecture administrators had quietly permitted anyway, in the specific. Grinding way violations accumulated in places far enough from the capital that nobody in the capital thought to check. Sena read the petition twice, cross-referenced it against the article's actual restored text the way 4 years of registry habit had trained her to verify anything before acting on it, and sent it back through the caretaker, prefecture's new formal channel, with a demand for immediate correction that carried, for the first time in that district's living memory, an authority behind it that the administrators receiving it could not simply file away and ignore. Defied's crew got their conscription hours reduced within the month, a small, unglamorous, entirely unbroadcast victory that never once made it onto any chorus feed. And Sena found, reading the foreman's brief, formal letter of thanks a week later, that it mattered to her more than the memory of the hall's dome and the roaring crowd on Remembrance Day ever had. On the evening after the first anniversary of Remembrance Day under her own speakership, Sena stood alone in the hall's central gallery long after the crowds had gone home, looking up at the dome's gray evening light settling over the dais, at the seat that had spent 24 years as a monument to an ending, and was now, however imperfectly, however much work remained to make it mean what it was supposed to mean, a chair someone actually sat in. She thought of the 6 pixels that had started it, the cracked line in a redaction someone had rushed through a generation ago under pressure no archivist's training could fully imagine, and she thought that If there was one thing 4 years of cataloging this world's buried paperwork had taught her, it was that no silence, however carefully constructed, however many years it was allowed to stand unchallenged, ever quite finished the job of covering what it was built to hide. Somewhere eventually, the crack always showed. She had only had to be the one still looking when it did. Sometimes, in the quiet hour after the hall emptied for the night, Sena still sat in the vestry office doing the small, unglamorous work of the office she had never expected to hold, and found herself thinking of the version of that day where the scanner at the checkpoint had caught the chip Vash pressed into her hand, or the version where Kareth's hesitation had gone the other way, or the dozen smaller, quieter versions where an old man's grief-worn city had simply decided, on the morning it mattered most, that the seat was safer left exactly as it had always been. None of those versions had happened. She did not know most days whether that was luck or stubbornness or the particular accumulated weight of every person who had chosen, in the last month of an oath's 24th year, to stop only staring at what they had lost and start deciding together what they still meant to keep. She only knew that the seat was no longer empty, and that Meridian's gray morning light, falling now through the hall's dome onto a chair someone actually used, looked, to her at least, very slightly less like mourning than it once had, and very slightly more like a beginning nobody had gotten around to naming yet.